Well, I got a little bit of a presentation here on a little scope stuff, and also, we talk a little bit about scopes and scoping. And this is not a comprehensive scope class or anything like that. I'm just hitting the highlights of it and all that. But one of the things that you see more and more and more, the accomplished cutting edge automotive technicians now are just about always using scopes. In my experience, scopes are not used as often at dealerships as they are in independent shops. Now, I don't know about all dealerships because there's lots and lots of dealerships all over the place, and there's like 850,000 mechanics in the country or something like that. But understanding a scope is not that difficult. Getting it set up, and I'm gonna actually put up together some videos when I do some scoping a little bit later. But it's going to be sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks probably, if I can make it happen. I got some stuff I'm going to do on my Explorer, and I'll probably do some scope stuff on my pickup truck at the same time. I like to wait until the weather cools off before I do that, and it's pretty cool now, and so it would probably be a good time for me to do that. Anyway, long and short of it is, this grid here, this is an exaggerated illustration of it that I snagged online, is a graticule, that's what they call that. And so basically this is voltage and this is time. When you set your time base and your voltage base on your scope, and let's say you set it on 20 milliseconds of time, that means each one of these little boxes represents 20 milliseconds. And you can kind of tell that if you set it on 500 milliseconds, you'll notice that it takes a half a second for the trace to go across each box. And that's basically you're zooming in and out on the pattern. And this right here, it's the same with the time base. If you've got the time base set, the time base is this way, the voltage is this way. If you set the voltage up on milliamps, or if you're using an amp probe or whatever, your millivolts and all that, if you set it on 20 millivolts, you'll have each one of these boxes is 20 millivolts. And it's basically like your old graph paper stuff you used to do when you were in school doing geometry and stuff. It's going to draw a picture. And that's really, really, really useful for trying to figure out what's wrong, especially if you know what's going on behind those squiggly lines. And we've talked a little bit about scope patterns and ignition and all that kind of stuff. I want to touch on that a little bit more today too. But here's a little case study that I picked up. This one came in for a flashing mill, had obvious loaded misfire, PO 303, PO 174, and PO 422. Now after recording those codes and the freeze frame, he cleared the DTCs and drove it to the replicate. That's what you do. You record the codes that were stored, and then you drive it to see if those codes come back and how quick. And you want to see which code comes back first, because a lot of times if you've got a misfire, that will cause you to have some of these other codes. All right, so it wasn't surprising. He got a new cylinder, turned into a PO 302. In other words, it was an 03 before, and then it turned into an 02, which matched twice more. Both banks are at plus 15% long fuel trim. Okay, so it's adding 15% fuel to both banks, which is pretty interesting. It was too late in the day to confirm, but the coil in the boot looked fine. The misfire stayed on number 2 when we swapped. So what he did was he swapped the plug and the coil from the hole that was skipping to the other holes that weren't, to see if the skip moved with it. And that's a pretty smart way to do that, because that way you can pinpoint it's the coil or it's the plug or whatever. But if the skip stays with the same hole, you know that you're not going to have a coil or a plug problem typically. All right, so you check the primary ignition wave. An attenuator is necessary here because regardless of whether you're going in here or if you're going to, this is an oil-filled coil, but you're basically going to the negative side of the coil, which is triggered to fire the coil. But every time the secondary is going to be putting out the really high voltage. However, this primary is going to put out something like 400 volts whenever it interrupts the, because the same kind of magnetic field collapse that's causing the high voltage spark also causes a lesser voltage spark to come screaming out of this one. They put an attenuator here because it protects your scope, and that way you don't get it destroyed there. All right, so you take your current clamp. If you want to do a current ramp, you're going to put it around this. If the PCM, from the PCM or whatever it is that's triggering that coil, you're going to put that around the one that's triggering it. So that's basically as simple as I can draw that. This is a cop coil on a Ford here. And so you got a negative. The negative side is going to be the one that's not red, that's not hot all the time. And so you can basically get, the cool thing about getting you can use the primary or the secondary and get really good information on what's going on with your spark. It's just that on the secondary, it's got a lot higher voltage. And so you can basically, you're going to be using different scope settings for primary than secondary. But a lot of your scopes nowadays, particularly if they're automotive function scopes, have got special settings already programmed in there where you can just go ignition primary, ignition secondary, ignition current ramp, and the scope will usually pull up on its screen. The one I've got it'll tell you how to hook everything up if you don't know. And it also automatically sets the scope to read these things. And it's really pretty cool how they've done that nowadays to give you a hand. Now, a normal primary pattern is going to have a firing line right here, and this is basically going to be your spark line. In other words, it first jumps across the gap. It takes that much to jump across the gap. All right, and after it begins to burn that fuel, you got fuel molecules that are carrying that spark. As those fuel molecules are consumed, you're going to have a little bit of an upkick right there at the end of the spark line, and the leftover spark is represented by these. It's like snapping a rubber band, sort of. But the length of it, basically, what you got here going on is your spark duration is how long this spark burns before it burns out. And that's a pretty good little thing too that you can go by if you're looking at that. I'm going to show you guys one of these days when I get out here with that little GTC 505, how you can measure. There's 16 different ways you can measure that waveform, and you can usually find out a whole heck of a lot of data about what's going on with your spark. Anyway, the Mazda 3.0 waveform looks like this, with number 2 loaded and misfiring. So he loaded it on number 2, and while it was misfiring, he had this crazy looking thing right here. See how much is going on right there? All right, so this is what a normal one would look like. I kind of pasted that in there so you could compare normal to that one. Now the coil ramp is as the coil is saturating, you're seeing current build up, and then whenever usually it won't look exactly the same on every vehicle because some of them limit the current and you'll have a slightly different pattern here, but it all is pretty much going to look like this. So this coil ramping is giving you a lot of information here. Notice how it drops off when it breaks the primary and this spark line jumps up. Okay, so you got this. This is normal. This is abnormal. We got something we're looking at right there. All right, now this is not missing when it wasn't missing. Now I still don't like the looks of this really, but it looks a lot more normal than that. See, this looks kind of screwy and weak and not quite like it ought to, but still you can tell a big difference between when it was skipping and when it wasn't skipping. Now what do you notice? You notice that the length of the spark line was a heck of a lot shorter here than it was there. See how this lengthened out? Now I will tell you this about this spark. Whatever goes this way will not go that way. So the higher that goes, the shorter this is going to be. And just keep that in mind as you go. All right, now raising voltage through burn time, it's a lean misfire. The first time I ran into anything like this was when I was working at the Volkswagen dealer, which at the time was right up here at the end of the street where I live, in 1983. And there was a scope that was hanging from a frame on top of the shop so you could roll it around to any service bay. It's pretty cool how they had that thing set up. Volkswagen, does some cool stuff with their requirements for their dealerships. But anyway, it was a sun scope, and I learned to read that thing, and I connected it up. And I noticed on this one Volkswagen Rabbit I was working on that whenever it would sputter and pop and cut out. And I said, well, I'm going to check this, with this scope. And I noticed that this spark line was crazy as all get out on that thing on every single one of the spark plugs. It was common to all the cylinders, and it was going higher than the spark line when it was misfiring. Now I wasn't doing current ramping, I was just basically doing the voltage here. And so here I was, this is whenever the points close, if you want to call them the points, and it begins to saturate and all that. Anyway, the one that I found out, that one that I was working on had a clogged up fuel filter. And that was causing that screwball pattern on the ignition. And so If you've got a lean misfire, you're going to have a whole lot of issues here because there won't be enough fuel in there for those fuel molecules to carry that juice to make it look like, all right, wait a minute, I went the wrong way, to make it look like that. So basically, you see that the fuel molecules that are carrying that spark are still burning before it kicks up like that and drops off. All right. Now, so here's what we had. Loss of fuel pressure or clogged injectors. You know, if the spark line was dropping instead of rising, it would mean excessive fuel. Basically, you know, there's some caveats there, but I will just say that. All right. Now, other pattern. This is a normal pattern. And this is a pattern, a bad plug wire when equipped with plug wires. You'll see that. Sometimes you'll see this thing right here. It will go up with a ragged all the way to the peak of that. It'll come down like that. And I would see that. I always like to watch it misfire. I mean, have it misfire while I'm watching the scope. And have somebody brake torque it or something like that. But anyway, you can see the difference between a normal pattern. You're expecting to see that little upkick. Now, this is pinched. You know, I could have stretched it out and shown you either. But anyway, this is just a pinched version of that. So this is your spark line. This is how far it is. And you notice on the graticule, you basically have the time base set so that it has squished the pattern and all that. So basically, there's where it used up the fuel. Now, this one here has got crazy stuff, but it doesn't have a whole lot of turbulence on that line. It's just got, that one had bad plug wire when equipped with plug wires. And remember, the spark happens at or just before top dead center. It does not typically happen at top dead center. Misfire in cylinder, compression stroke, and then companion cylinder exhaust stroke is going to be upside down, you know, because you're basically, both sides of this coil are firing at the same time, and the one that's going into the exhaust doesn't have any fuel molecules to carry it, so most of it is going to wind up going over here where it's needed. Fire in cylinder compression stroke, companion cylinder exhaust stroke. You see that? All right, so that's a waste spark waveform is what that is. Now this was this one here had a manual transmission, 2003 350Z manual transmission. Incidentally, that problem with that other one was a fuel injector issue. Is what that was, as I remember. This one's a little more interesting though. Okay, so 350Z, manual transmission, 106,000 miles, and incidentally when it moves from one cylinder to the other is always spooky. I never have like how sometimes those skips move and you don't know exactly when they did. They just bought the car off of an individual, no pre-purchase inspection, real sketchy and limited information on service history, most of which was secondhand word of mouth. Customer concern was check engine light, no power, won't rev past 2,500 RPM, and it had a heavy misfire. All right, so the faults were read out of the entire car. Lots of garbage in secondary systems about battery voltage, you know, comms and everything else. You ignore those to start with, but you pay attention to the engine faults. P0011, P0021, P00345, camshaft sensor, except that, you know, code I think has got an extra number in it. Camshaft sensor circuit bank 2. Should be a P0345. All right, so they got something going on here. All right, so during a visual inspection, he paid attention to timing cover. Now, this is always pertinent. Timing cover had new silicone. Multiple things had been disassembled and put back together in a way that, you know, showed whoever did it was not a professional. Bolts missing, different bolts used, things found loose. You know, if you see somebody just, you know, if you got these bolts, it's got this beautiful little 8mm head and a built-in washer, and they just screwed a regular 6mm bolt they got out of the bolt bin in there. You know, I always hate that kind of stuff. I want to put it back just like it's supposed to look when it was new. Brackets missing, wiring that had been repaired, so on and so forth. So looking at the live data, Bank 1 intake valve timer was 14.5 degrees retarded, and Bank 2 intake valve timer was 18.5 retarded, and locked at idle when the vehicle warmed up. And it ran just like they said, 2,500 RPM max, misfire, no power. So he located a few known good crank cam correlation waveforms for the engine from the fella techs online, and went on ahead and scoped both cam position and the crank position sensor to verify signals, as well as possibly getting a standing on engine timing. What he found was interesting. Both banks were retarded as best he could tell based on the waveform, but the signal from Bank 1 cam position was garbage and sporadically hung at 5 volts for extended period of time. Odd, because the ECM had identified the issue with the other bank. And this is what he wound up seeing. This is on his Picoscope here. All right, and so what he wound up with, this was the one that, see, he had the reference waveform down here below it, so he could compare this with what it was looking like. In other words, he's using this for reference, and this was the one before he put a cam position sensor on it. All right, and so that's the one that he was concerned about right there, that just absolutely did not look like it was supposed to look. I mean, there's nothing down here that looks anything like this up here. Now these Hall effect sensors, particularly on Nissans, I don't know, they probably might happen on other vehicles too. I've seen those things do crazy stuff and make it look like the engine was out of time when it really wasn't, when all it was a sensor problem. Anyway, this guy right here was moving in the direction. This is, all right, so after cam position bank 1 replacement, both cam position signals were clean and direct copies of each other, but waveform showed, in fact, both winks were retarded by 16.6 degrees. All right, now he's got a little Bart Simpson head stuff going on here, but that's typically a little bit of interference, you know, from other stuff, and you just, you know, kind of ignore that if you can read those. I always like for them to be clean and crisp and all that kind of thing, which is sometimes kind of difficult to deal with. Matter of fact, I'm going to temporarily exit out of this right here, and I'm going to show you a Picoscope pattern I got right here. And on the Picoscope pattern, if you want to move this is an actual Picoscope pattern from another Nissan, and see how you can take your grab the green one and move it up like that, so it's eclipsing that one, right? And this is a V6 engine, kind of like that one right there. And this is your crank signal. You grab the blue one, you can move it around too. See, if you wanted to put it up here and just overlay it on top, it's pretty neat how you can do that. And then you go over here, you can grab the red one and do that too. You can also zoom in. See, zoom in and out. I'm rolling my mouse wheel to do that. And it's kind of giving you, down here, this thing here gives you which part of the pattern you're looking at. It's got a little box drawn around it. But anyway, I'm just playing around with that. You can look at your channel labels down here. Now, it doesn't put those on there automatically. You got to tell it what you're putting in there when you hook your scope up. And this is going to tell you the scale that you're on and what you're reading and all that kind of thing. All right, now let me go back here to, go back in here to that one again. All right, so that's where we are on that. All right, this worked out mathematically. You notice this is, he's actually got 0 marked right here on that, and so that's telling him that he's at 16 degrees, 16.7 degrees on that, out of time, you know. And so he needed to go and find out what the hell was going on. But it was a no start now. What the heck is that all about? I will tell you this, on these Nissans, sometimes you can actually, and I mentioned this I think last week, you can unplug the cam sensor on a Nissan and it may start and it may not. So cam sensors on Nissans make them do crazy things. On a lot of the Fords, you can unplug the cam sensor and it don't care. It just throws you a PO340 code and the gas mileage goes to pot. And that kind of thing, you know. But once the timing cover was removed, they found a brand new water pump, and by some miracle, the timing chain had gone X number of revolutions. See, here's the thing. When you're turning that thing with those colored links, right? When you're turning it with those colored links, you basically don't see those colored links lining up every time with the teeth. If you could look at that with a timing light, or if you know, and so that you could run that thing, you'll see those colored links walking all the way around. Your marks on your gears are going to keep, you know, being in time, but those colored links are going to walk all the way around, and they're going to eventually come back and walk past their marks again. But they ought to be walking past the cam marks at the same time if the camshafts are in time. So whenever they're, you'd have to turn them a heck of a lot of times by hand to get them to line up, you know, with those marks. So you'll say, okay, well, I'm going to get my colored links up here. So you turn your colored links up and your marks are pointing somewhere else. That doesn't mean it's out of time. It just means that your colored links are walking. And that's what they basically do. I mean, because there's so many links in the chain. And, you know, first time I ran into that, I was extremely frustrated. And I think it was on a 89 Eagle Talon when I was timing I think that was on a timing belt though, but when I was timing the balancer, it was like that. You could line that thing up perfectly, but if you spun it through and you wanted to see those marks line up again, you got to go a lot of turns before they line up again. That was a pain. Anyway, so he got the colored links to match the camshaft marks correctly, That is 1 in a million. You don't hardly ever see that happen just automatically. You got to turn it through a lot of the time until they walk around. I don't know how many turns, but you know what I'm saying. They found the crankshaft gear was a full link chain off. Here's your pictures, and there's the colored links. And this one right here was the mark where that was supposed to be. And this one right here lined up. But look at that crank. That crank is a tooth off right there. And so if you did the math on that, you would see how many degrees off that was. You know, so if this one here, well, you know, if you line that one up with these right here, then you're in time. And what it amounted to is they weren't. But that was the pictures that the guy took with that. I thought that was really good. Now here's you a pop test. Let's look at this pop test. What will this line do if you stretch the spark on this spark plug? You pull it off, pop, 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 and you can see it popping its lightning toward the top of this plug while you're watching the scope pattern. What are you going to get there? What does this upkick in the spark line mean? All right. What do these squiggles mean? All right. What is this screwy pattern right here? My goodness, look how all stacked together there. All right. What is this pattern? See, we're going through this pretty quick. If I'm going fast, too fast for you, you can pause, right? All right. What is this pattern? All right. What's wrong with this pattern? Question 7. What 2 data points were measured to gather this relative compression test? Okay. What is a waste spark system? What's the difference between closed loop fuel control and open loop fuel control? I was going to put you a picture in there, but I didn't take the time to do that. What system is this? Okay, answers to the questions. This gets taller, and when you stretch that, this gets taller. And you know, if you pull it all the way off, it gets way taller. If you took like a screwdriver and you stuck it up in there, you know, wedged it between the boot and the terminal and laid it against the valve cover, whatever, you know, unless it was a plastic valve cover, you know what I'm talking about. If you grounded it, then it would go low. Now, if you're worried about getting shocked by one of these ignition systems, you don't want it to run across your chest and stop your heart, put one of these straps on your arm and hook it to a ground somewhere on the engine so that if it does jump and hit your hand, it basically goes through the strap into the engine, and that's the only place it goes. That's a pretty smart way to do that. Keep your knees off of the chrome bumper. You know what I mean? Don't, you know, keep one hand behind your back so that the only place, and if you're not touching it, the only place that you want this spark to go is just to hit that one hand. You don't want it running through your body because that's really dangerous, right? What does this upkick in the spark line mean? All the fuel was consumed. I talked about that earlier. This is a beautiful picture of that. It's like a textbook version of it. You don't usually see them looking exactly perfect like this, but sometimes they do. And these squiggles are leftover energy. If you see just like a dip down here, that means that basically there's not enough energy in the coil to really do anything other than barely get by, you know. So if you don't see these squiggles, you probably got a weak ignition coil, or there's something that's robbing some of the voltage. Like if you hook a test light to your primary wire and watch it pulse, you'll see these squiggles go away because your test light bulb's gobbling up some of the current that's wanting to saturate the coil. This pattern is multi-strike. My buddy Donnie was working on a early 90s Escort, even before OBD2. These Escorts had three, they would fire 3 times when they were idling. Crown Victorias do that too. They'll fire the coil 3 times every time they idle. Think about that. Well, these Crown Victorias are idling a lot in hot weather. The coil is working really, really hard because it's got to go pop, pop, pop every time if you're not idling. If you're idling a lot, you're probably going to have a lot of coil failures on these, like taxis and stuff like that. So anyway, as soon as you crack it off of throttle, this is not, this is kind of like multiple spark discharge, but those actually are doing it all the time. And this one right here, what it does, when you crack it off of idle, you'll wind up with just one right here. All the other ones go away. But my buddy Donnie was working on this Escort one time, and he was standing over kind of to the side of the engine, and he goes, I got a misfire over here, I think I got a spark leak. And this thing was idling, and it was doing that multi-spark thing you're seeing right there. And he managed to reach over there, and that thing reached out and got him, and it popped his hand, and he banged his knee on the fender, and he banged his head on the hood, and he staggered back with his eyes almost glazed over. And he looked at the fender and there was a dent in it. And he says, "Did I make a dent in that fender?" I never did know if he did or not, but that was funny. Multi-track spark though. Now you might, some of you guys that have fooled with MSD ignition might say a lot, most of the time, if not all the time, multiple spark discharge ignition does not break the ground on the coil, it breaks the hot side. And so, I mean, I guess because that makes it a little hotter even, yeah. This right here is an injector pulse. You know, this is the amount of, you're measuring basically the wire that's triggering the injector. And this is the pulse of how long the injector is open on your time base. And whenever you release the injector, you got a little bit of a collapse of the magnetic field on the injector windings, and you got about 50 volts that's going to jump up right here. But that's your injector pulse line. All right, this is a cam crank at 1 and 2, and this is on like a 5.4, you know, or a Ford pickup truck. And so this one right here is the cam's out of time. You see that? So these are out of line. Let me back up right quick, if I can make that work. Okay, see how the cams are all lined up, pretty much like they're supposed to be. And if you do a cam trace on these and you see them looking like that, you know that's screwed up. You probably got the sliders and the tensioner stuff and all that nonsense giving you trouble down there. And there's your missing tooth with, you know, 36 minus 1 and all that. This one right here, starter voltage and amperage. Now this test right here was done with a program that I had. It cost about $1,200 when I was at college over, and it was called ACE Misfire Detective, which was a very comprehensive, well-written program. But you had to sometimes, like it would actually, you put a little pulse sensor in the exhaust, and you would hook up to the #1 spark plug wire, and you let it idle, and you would tell it to check for misfires, and it would basically read the puffs on the exhaust, and it would use the for the trigger, it would use the #1 ignition pulse, so that it could tell you which cylinders were misfiring. Now what I found that this thing would do when I was using it was not always consistent. You'd have to run it several times and get the idea of which one was the closest to what was actually going on. But this is pretty accurate right here. The same program was doing this and all, and so I mean, I actually did this one on a vehicle at the college over there. But voltage goes down, amperage goes up. So you're basically connecting voltage and amperage, and you're spinning it over, and you're not starting it, you're just spinning it over, and you're going to let it spin for a while till it tells you to spin it and how long to spin it. When it tells you it's done, it basically, of course, you got to have it triggered so it knows where #1 is too, but you've killed the fuel supply. And that's how you got to tell how many cylinders it has too down here, so it will know how many times to count. And so that's a pretty cool little way of doing that. You can actually do a relative, I've got that BT608 machine over there that will do a relative compression test, and it was basically designed to do check batteries and starters and alternators and everything. I'll show you all that one of these days too if I haven't already. Waste spark system is the one that's fire. It's got 3 coils. It's got 1 hot, and they've got 3 triggers, and it's firing in the exhaust and the intake stroke at the same time on companion cylinders. That's when they're both up, right? The difference between closed and open loop fuel control. Open loop is when the O2 sensor isn't being factored in. Cold engine, wide open throttle, so on and so forth. Whenever you're trying to pass a semi going up a hill, you don't want the PCM trying to give you the best fuel economy. You just want to pour the cold of that thing and get it around, get it around the truck before another one comes over the hill, whatever. And so there's the open loop and closed loop. The closed loop systems are all over these cars, and it's not just on the oxygen sensor part of it too. Like for example, your EGR is a closed loop system because it's going to be measuring how much EGR flow there is, or if it's flowing or not, while it's giving it a, you know, it's basically going to dither the EGR flow so that it will know how much is flowing, and because it knows how much it needs. You see what I'm saying? So it'll have a sensor that'll be reading how much is flowing. Some of the Asian cars like to put a temperature sensor in the exhaust and the exhaust gas recirculation so they can read the temperature to see if it's flowing, and you know, and all that kind of thing. But anyway, there's other closed loop stuff too. This is the enhanced evaporative system. Basically what it does right here, it's got a sensor that measures tank pressure, and it will actually stop this one up. It will deliver a little bit of water vacuum, and I say water vacuum because it's a really weak vacuum, and it's not in inches of mercury, it's like inches of water. You can measure vacuum with water or mercury, but the numbers are different. And water vacuum is always a lot weaker. But the point is, it puts a little bit of water vacuum on this tank and also on this canister. It stops that up, and then it measures by looking at the feedback to see how fast it bleeds up. If it bleeds up too fast, it knows there's a leak somewhere, and you got to put your smoke in there and go find it and all that. Okay. Then after it has done that, it releases this, and it measures how fast that vacuum bleeds back up. If this little thing is stopped up with dust under this cover here, which is a screen under there, and it bleeds up too slow, then it will throw you, or if the canister itself is loaded with dust, you know. Nowadays, they've got, most of the time, they've got a filter that is going to filter all the air that's coming into this canister. Because see, whenever the engine vacuum is being delivered to purge the canister, you know, where the vapors are stored, then it's going to need to pull fresh air in there. You see what I'm saying? So anyway, there's your enhanced evaporative system. And there that is. All right. Until next time, I hope you guys really enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. This one here is kind of different from the one that I usually do, but like I say, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week.